Hello again, everybody. What I have here to your guys' left is an original bottle of Crystal Pepsi from 1992. And then what I have here to your guys' right is an original bottle of Crystal from Pepsi from 1994. Now, the title of today's video is going to be what was actually different between Crystal from Pepsi and Crystal Pepsi. Now, most of you that are watching this video, or most of you that have watched a lot of Maximus the Fourth, probably already know the story of Crystal Pepsi, but in case some of you out there might not know it, Crystal Pepsi was a clear cola of Pepsi that was first created in 1992 in order to compete with Coca-Cola's Vanilla Coke. And at first, people were pretty curious about it. They were definitely trying it out because they wanted to see what it was like. But then the next year that came by, it just really wasn't doing that well. So very shortly after just a year, maybe a little bit more than that, it was discontinued. And then about a year later, Pepsi decided to come out with another clear cola of Pepsi. This one was called Crystal from the makers of Pepsi, but everybody just called it Crystal from Pepsi for short. Now, although Crystal from Pepsi was a clear cola, just like Crystal Pepsi, it still was very much its own entity, and it absolutely was not Crystal Pepsi. Crystal Pepsi and Crystal from the makers of Pepsi, two completely different names and two completely different things. Now, the thing that we all might know, and those of you that have watched my previous videos before, is that the real main difference between Crystal from Pepsi was that it had a new citrus taste, as you guys can see right there. Whereas the original Crystal Pepsi didn't really have a citrus flavor. It was just kind of a much more closer tasting soda to normal Pepsi, but might have just had a little bit of a lighter flavor. But what actually was in Crystal from Pepsi that really did make its own complete entity in giving Crystal from Pepsi that very distinct citrusy taste that original Crystal Pepsi didn't have? Well, I've just wrote down all the ingredients of both of these, and now I'm going to read to you guys the ingredients of both Crystal Pepsi and Crystal from the makers of Pepsi. And today, this burning question that needs to be answered, is going to be put to rest once and for all. So original Crystal Pepsi from 1992 had carbonated water, high fructose corn syrup and or sugar, phosphoric acid, which is a corrosive that helps form 3 different salts. It had citric acid, natural flavorings, and modified food starch, which was a thickening to help thicken the liquid a little bit. But even modified food starch was dropped from Crystal Pepsi after the first year of them producing it. Now, Crystal from Pepsi had carbonated water, high fructose corn syrup and or sugar, citric acid, natural flavorings, and it had 2 different chemicals in here to act as preservatives to preserve the freshness, and that was potassium citrate and potassium benzoate. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at the differences, or the things of Crystal from Pepsi and Crystal Pepsi, and see what was actually the same. They both had carbonated water, and they both had high fructose corn syrup. And that is the only true identical ingredients that these both really had. Now, the next major difference was that Crystal Pepsi had phosphoric acid, which is a corrosive that helps form 3 different salts. And as I'm looking right here, Crystal from Pepsi did not have phosphoric acid at all. The next major difference is that Crystal from Pepsi had citric acid as the third ingredient. In Crystal Pepsi from 1992 had citric acid as the fourth ingredient. So because they used more citric acid in Crystal from Pepsi, that is what gave it that very potent and very distinct taste. And that right there is the major difference between Crystal from Pepsi and Crystal Pepsi. Now, looking forward at these, another thing that really changed the flavor in Crystal from Pepsi was that it had more natural flavors in it than Crystal Pepsi from 1992. It didn't have modified food starch in it like Crystal Pepsi did, which probably wouldn't have really affected the flavor anyways. But the real last difference between these two was that Crystal from Pepsi had both potassium citrate and potassium benzoate, which preserve the freshness. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is really the complete difference between Crystal Pepsi and Crystal from the makers of Pepsi, and why Crystal from Pepsi really had that distinct, different citrus taste. Thank you for watching, guys.